So this week we're going to learn about the first Americans. These were the Native Americans that were here in what is today North America before Christopher Columbus or any of the European explorers came onto the scene. And so as we talk today, we're going to break these Native American tribes into 5 different regions of North America. So we'll talk about 5 different regions of Native Americans, and then you'll see the differences between each one in terms of what their housing was, were they hunters or farmers, and what was their way of life like. So we'll start in our area, which is the Northeast. The Northeast tribes included areas in what is today Pennsylvania, Ohio, New England area of New York and New Hampshire and Rhode Island and all of the New England states. And it also included kind of the Delaware, Maryland area as well. And these tribes included the Algonquin, the Iroquois. The Iroquois made up the Iroquois League, which was a few tribes, a lot of tribes, that decided to have a peace agreement that if one tribe went to war, the other tribe would go with them and help them in their war. And so the Iroquois had the famous Iroquois League, which was a very strong group of tribes that were linked together. You also had the Susquehanna in this area, where we get our Susquehanna River that flows through Harrisburg. And you had the Delaware Indians as well, and they were down in the Philadelphia area. The Native Americans in this part of the country, or of North America at the time, they had a matrilineal system. And what that means is that when a husband and a wife got married, when a man and a woman got married, the husband would leave his family and go and join the family of the woman. And so the matrilineal system went through the woman rather than the man. And in this type of system, women often enjoyed more rights than they did in a patrilineal system where the female leaves her family and goes to live with her husband's family. These Native Americans in the northeastern part of our country, of North America, they lived in what was called longhouses, and you can see the picture here of the longhouse. And the longhouses were basically made out of different parts of trees, and a longhouse was made for a large family. Oftentimes Native Americans in this part of the country lived with their extended family, and that wouldn't be out of the ordinary for them to have 10 or 15 people living in one house. The next region that we'll look at is the Southeast region. And this is the region that includes the tribes of the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. This is our modern-day Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, even southern Tennessee, and South Carolina, North Carolina area. And these 5 tribes that lived in this area became known as the 5 quote-unquote civilized tribes, because they attempted, when the Europeans got here, they attempted to assimilate or to blend in with the European society. So they adopted Christianity as their religion. They dressed like the Europeans. They had European-style schools for their children. And they even adopted the form of government that the Europeans had. Unfortunately, that didn't help them, because later in the 1800s, under President Andrew Jackson, the 3 of these tribes, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Cherokee, were forced on what was called the Trail of Tears. And this was a 1,000-mile journey from Georgia area, what is today Georgia area, to what is today Oklahoma, that these 3 tribes were forced to make because the American government found gold in the area in Georgia where they were living. Also, people wanted to expand. The Americans wanted to expand, and they didn't want the Native Americans to be in their way. And so in a very sad story, the Trail of Tears happens, and these thousands of Native Americans are forced to make this journey in the middle of winter with not enough supplies, and several thousand of them die along the journey. We'll learn more about the Trail of Tears later in the year, but we just touched on it for today. Also in the Southeast, the Native American tribes, they would tend to be farmers rather than hunters. Because they lived in the South, it's warmer for most of the year, and the soil is very fertile, and so they were able to plant lots of crops and then harvest those crops all year round. So this was very beneficial for them. Because they were able to have farms, they didn't have to move around a lot, and so they were able to build more permanent houses Oftentimes these houses had thatched or grass roofs, and those they used of the things that were growing in the South. So next we're going to move to the Southwest. The Southwest Native American tribes that were here before the Europeans included groups like the Apache, the Hopi and the Zuni, who were both also called the Pueblo, and the Navajo. These tribes were located in what is today Arizona, Southern California, New Mexico, parts of Texas, and even into Mexico. And these tribes often lived in adobe clay houses like the one you see in the picture right here. And the adobe clay houses would be built either into the side of cliffs or out of this kind of adobe hard clay. And they would build them several levels up, oftentimes 2 or 3 levels up. And they would use ladders to get to the second and the third floor. And why was this important? Well, it was important because if your enemies were attacking you, you could climb up the ladder to the second or third floor, pull your ladder up inside with you, and the enemies would have no way to get to you. Some of the Native Americans in this area also lived in hogans, which were a type of permanent house made out of the same adobe clay that was built more on the ground and not in the high level area like the adobe clay houses were. The next region that we'll go to look at Native Americans from before the Europeans arrived is the Northwest. The Northwest tribes, the Northwestern tribes, this area was in what we would today classify as the northwestern part of the United States, including states like Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, parts of Montana, and then going up through Canada, going north through Canada, and eventually getting to modern-day Alaska. And these tribes included tribes like the Inuit, or they're also known as the Eskimo, the Dogrib, and the Tagish. The tribes from this area that lived in the very, very northern part, up towards Alaska and the northern parts of Canada, they relied on fishing and hunting a lot. The northern tribes would rely on hunting polar bears and walruses and killing whales and things like that for their well-being. Farming was not a part of this region really at all. Some of the tribes that were in Washington State today and Oregon might have done a little bit of fishing, a little bit of hunting, excuse me, but they relied mainly on fishing and hunting. The tribes in the very north, they lived in igloos like the one you see in the picture here. And the tribes in the very south, they lived in something called plank houses, which were made out of a cedar wood that grew in the northwestern part of the United States. Finally, we'll talk about the fifth region, which were the Great Plains Indians. And the Great Plains Indians were in the modern-day states of North and South Dakota, Wyoming, Kansas, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota. These states were where the Great Plains tribe Indians roamed. And they included tribes like the Sioux, the Mandan, the Crow, and the Cheyenne. And they often would live in teepees like the one you see in the picture here. And the teepees that they lived in were designed specifically so they could be packed up if the tribe needed to leave in a hurry. The teepees were often made out of buffalo skins, and they had a hole in the middle at the top so that they could have a fire inside to keep them warm, and the smoke could go out the top of the almost like a chimney. The reason why they needed their teepees to be mobile is because the Great Plains Native Americans were nomadic, and that means that they had to move around from place to place. They did very little, if any, farming, because they oftentimes were following the buffalo herds across the plains. They would kill the buffaloes, and they would use the buffalo, every single part of the buffalo. You can see this picture of a nice bull bison here, or a bull buffalo, and almost every single part of the buffalo ended up being used by the Native Americans. Their horns were used for tools. Obviously, they ate the meat. The skins were used for clothing and for teepees, and they used just about everything in the whole animal to help keep them alive. And so this is a summary. We've just talked about the five different regions of Native Americans that lived here before Christopher Columbus and the other European explorers arrived. What you're going to do now is attached to this presentation, to this Prezi on Schoology, is a graphic organizer that goes along with this. Go ahead and you may rewatch this if you need to, or you can fill out the graphic organizer going back through the video as you need to. After you complete the graphic organizer, upload it and submit it to me on Schoology.